Hey there, I'd just like to ask before the video starts, if you like what you see, please give us a click on the like and subscribe buttons. Hello, I'm Karl Wells. My guest today has spent much of her life in the academic world. She's from St. John's, grew up in St. John's, received her undergraduate education in this city, and then did her postgraduate work at the United States and England, at Duke University and the University of London, respectively. She is currently the Dean Emerita of History at Eastern Michigan University. And I'm sorry, not Dean Emerita, Professor Emerita in History at Eastern Michigan University and the Dean Emerita at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, University of Illinois at Springfield. And it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Margot Duley to the program. Did I get all of that right?
You did. Well done to remember all these many titles.
Margot, there's so many things I could talk to you about, but what I'm really fascinated by lately is your book, which I found on Amazon. And it was written back in the 1990s, but it's such a great story, and it's called Where Once Our Mothers Stood, We Stand. And folks, if you can get your hand on this book, on Amazon's a good bet, do so, because it's a fabulous read. Anyhow, you just told me that you've got a kind of a follow-up book coming to this.
I do. I found, after, it's 30 years later, that there was a lot more material to find. And of course, you think about what you've written in previous decades, and sometimes you see the evidence in a different way. So I caught the historian's disease. I decided to see, how did women break silences politically? Because the ability to speak in public is kind of a precursor to arguing about suffrage. And so I took the story all the way back to the early 18th century and then bring it up to the suffrage movement and expand on that. But thank you for the plug of the previous
it's something
book.
to look forward to, and I will definitely be picking it up and reading it, and
Well,
I hope you folks do as well. But let's deal with this book,
Yes.
Because it's such a great story. Now, the genesis of it happened in London, England. You were doing research, and you read something that really piqued your interest in this story, correct?
Yes. Well, I describe it as the book that found me. If you had asked me back in the 1980s, which is when I stumbled on material about the Newfoundland women's suffrage movement in London, was I going to end up writing something about Newfoundland? I was trained in Indian history, South Asian history. And I went to London. I got a grant, as a matter of fact, to go to London to research an alliance between feminists in India and Western feminists, and they were all joined together, along with many other countries, in something called the International Alliance of Women for Suffrage and Equal Citizenship, to give the full title. And so I went there to write about India. And in the course of kind of pawing through many boxes of documents, to my astonishment, there was a file there that said Newfoundland branch. And I'm in this very quiet library called the Fawcett Library, and it was established by really women who've been involved in first wave suffrage movement, named Fawcett after Millicent Fawcett, who was the leader of the moderates in England. And I remember sitting in this very quiet library, there weren't many others in there, fortunately, and seeing this file saying Newfoundland branch, and I shouted out loud practically in the library, oh my heavens! In the files there were various documents, but what I remembered most was a list of members. And I went home that Christmas to my mother and started to read down the list, and I'd say, who was this, who was that? She was younger than the suffrage generation. She was 15 or so as it was going on. But I remember getting to one name, which was May Kennedy. I said, Mother, who was May Kennedy? And she said, my dear, that was Mrs. Goodrich across the street. And I was stunned because I remembered Mrs. Goodrich with her beautiful chiffon hat going off to the garden party at Government House, and then occasionally I would earn 5 cents from her to run an errand over to W.J. Murphy's at Rollins Cross, and it just stunned me to know that she was involved in the suffrage movement. Yeah. So the book found me. When I saw that, I remembered very dimly some of these women in my youth. I thought, I have got to write this tale. So that's what set it off. But I did not set out to write a book about the women's suffrage movement in Newfoundland.
Well, it's amazing. It's an amazing thing. So late 19th century, in Newfoundland, you had a real problem with drinking, over-drinking, yes. And it was having a terrible effect on families, women and children especially, and there was this move to start a prohibition movement, and at the same time, there was an interest in women's suffrage. Mm-hmm. And both of these, the Prohibition movement, which was mainly led by women, and the women's suffrage movement, obviously led by women, there was a kind of a linkage that happened between them, correct?
There was. The prohibitionists, of course, are remembered with some amusement usually these days as spoil sports. But if you look more deeply into what they were tackling, there was, I think, unimpeachably, a serious drinking problem in Newfoundland at the time. Obviously, it didn't affect everybody. But if you look at the number of taverns in St. John's, per person, it is absolutely staggering. It's like one tavern for about, by the 1890s, about 140 or 150 people. Now, by people, I mean men, women, and children. And at this time, you could cash your paycheck or your little chit that you got from the merchant or whatever in the tavern. Most people didn't have bank accounts. So it was a great temptation to spend at least part of the paycheck after horrible days at work in the tavern. And there was also a tremendous problem, unfortunately it still exists, with domestic violence. And what the women involved in the temperance movement began to associate was domestic violence, poverty, and crime with alcohol. And I think another explanation for why this became such a huge issue is there was semi-plausible scientific evidence. It wouldn't withstand any sort of scrutiny today, but semi-plausible at the time, that drinking almost irrevocably led to alcoholism. So they get into this prohibitionist framework. There were many male prohibitionists around. They tended to argue the case in terms of costs to the government for, poor relief and the policemen and things like that. Women certainly noticed that, but mostly they focused on the gender issue of family poverty and violence. And they began to want to vote on the prohibition issue. And at that time, there was something called a local option election in Newfoundland. Every electoral district could decide whether it wanted to go dry or not. And what they wanted was simply a vote in their local communities. They weren't even asking for a national vote on all issues. It was simply a prohibition vote at the local level. And so that's how the issue of women's suffrage first gets engaged.
Now, a significant date in the history of women's suffrage was March 18th, 1891.
That's right.
Because there was a march that happened here in St. John's.
There was.
And at the end of that march, an appeal, the first appeal for women's suffrage was made, but it was kind of soft-pedaled, wasn't it?
It was. Soft-pedaled in two different ways. One is that they're only asking for a vote in local option elections, but it's soft-pedaled in another way. It was so extraordinary for women to leave their domestic sphere and enter into the male sphere of politics that it's as if they didn't know quite how to present the petitions, nor did the House of Assembly. Even though women had signed the petitions, almost invariably, there's only 3 exceptions, and there were dozens and dozens and dozens of petitions. In most cases, a local clergyman or a local worthy of some sort would sign it formally and present it on behalf of the women to the Assembly. Then when they arrive, and actually this is a little later, when the first debate occurs, again, people didn't know what to do. It was just so extraordinary to enter the male sphere that women have to stay down in a room in kind of the basement area of the House of Assembly while their bill is being debated. Mm-hmm. By the time the second debate comes around, people are a little more sensible and they're up in the galleries. But it just shows you what a radical notion this was. Mm-hmm.
There were 2 major politicians, William mm-hmm. Whiteway,
yes,
Robert Bond,
yes,
who were against bringing forward suffrage legislation and prohibition legislation. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, Bond never really said why, what the philosophical objections were. Whiteway was much more vocal about it. It's quite extraordinary to read his speeches, 100 years later, well, more than 100 years later. He was definitely opposed to women leaving the domestic sphere. Now, this is a very middle-class notion, because if you look at working-class families, a lot of the ideology that he's espousing just seems ridiculous. It's that women can't do hard physical labor, they can't deal with matters of state because their minds aren't as developed as male intelligence. Women would be flighty. I mean, on and on and on and on it goes. But underlying, really, quite a bit of misogyny, as we would see it now, were some political calculations. Mm-hmm. His party was badly divided. There was every description of ideology when it came to alcohol in his party. There were those who drank, there were prohibitionists, there were those who drank moderately and thought the way that you dealt with problems of domestic violence or whatever was by education. So he's got a very, in terms of prohibition, not necessarily on other issues, he's got a very delicate political bit of maneuvering to do. So really what he's doing, I think, is dodging the issue. He's trying to get it off the table.
As politicians are wont to do.
Exactly, it is ever thus. And so he just wants to sweep it off the table and get rid of them because they're a destabilizing force in Newfoundland politics. So I think that's what's going on.
So were there any men who were for prohibition and suffrage?
There were. The most intriguing person, I think, in this era was Donald Morrison, mm-hmm. who, and he and Sir James Spearman Winter, who presented the suffrage bills, really get it at a much deeper level. The women are soft-pedaling, as you put it, their demand. They simply want to vote on local option, although I think some of them really harbored much more radical notions. They wanted to vote on everything, but this is a start. So they soft pedal. But Morrison and Winter both basically get it and make extraordinary speeches for the time that it would do well in a 20th century legislature. that women are of equal intelligence, equal ability. It's nonsensical, especially when Queen Victoria is sitting on the throne and giving advice to government ministers, behind the scenes. It's absurd to be saying that women can't vote. And Morrison himself really deserves a study in his own. I think there's an interesting kind of background tale here. His sister was extremely intelligent, Mary Morrison, later Mary Miller when she married. She wanted to become a doctor. The family weren't having anything to do with it, and they poured their education fund into him, and he becomes a lawyer. And I think there's a little bit of guilt about this, because not only does he argue the case for women voting in the legislature, but later in his life, he's a lawyer. He accepts his niece, Janet Miller, Murray Eyre, into his practice, the first woman to be enter into articles in a law firm in Newfoundland, and then he had to argue with the Law Society that she should be admitted. So he really got it at a very deep level for a man of that generation. So my hat is off to him.
The press, in 1893, the Evening Telegram,
Yes.
the people's paper,
Right.
publish a scathing editorial against women's suffrage. What effect did this have on the community?
Well, it had, I would say, a very deleterious effect on their campaign. It comes just before a key vote in the House. There's this broadside against women voting. It's extraordinary to read it. The women involved are all church ladies. They're running the Ladies' Aid at the Presbyterian Church, or Gower Street, or Cochrane Street, or the Congregational Church at the time, which still existed at the time. And yet
which were very important at that time, especially.
That's right. And they're described as women who want to destroy the family, who are godless, they're harridans, they are... And then at the end of this diatribe, there's a phrase, something to the effect of, "From these maddened ladies, oh God, deliver us." So it's just an extraordinary editorial. So it has a bad impact politically, but also when you think of the fact that women really hadn't entered into the brawling nature of politics up to this point. Now, the attacks on social media, etc., you kind of go, ho hum, there they go again. The misogynists go again. But can you just imagine what it would have felt like psychologically in the 1890s to face that sort of hostility as a nice, well-brought-up, middle-class church lady?
Yes, exactly. So the next thing that happened was the linkage between the suffragists and the temperance people, that they went their separate ways.
Yes, they did.
And what's the story on that?
Well, I think that, first of all, prohibition wasn't a wildly popular issue, although it did get through the Newfoundland legislature in World War I as a war measure, and then it was quickly reversed and everybody ignored it anyway. The more discerning realized that the issue of suffrage had turned into really a sectarian issue. It is women from the Methodist churches, the Congregationalist Church, and the Presbyterian Church, which was split on the issue of alcohol, who are arguing this case. And Church of England women and Roman Catholic women are sitting back. They're not involved in this argument at all. And so I think partly it collapses for... it was just too sectarian. It was also too unpopular. And so the case for suffrage begins to be argued in a very different way. And the different way initially was what's called maternal feminism, that women deserve the vote to protect their families, that everything that happens in society, the price of food, taxation, whether there are decent roads, schools, everything, ultimately impacts a family, and it was a woman's role to protect her children and bring them up as best she could. And so the maternalist feminist ideology begins to be the predominant argument, and then eventually a more equal rights notion begins to be argued based on the fact that, heavens, not everyone is a mother. So that's the ideology evolves over time.
Right. Now, the women who formed the movement, they were for the most part from the upper classes, were they not?
They were certainly middle class, yes. It starts with the ladies' reading room, and technically any woman who paid $1 a year could be a member of the ladies' reading room. It was down on Water Street, apparently with a lovely view of the harbor, now blocked by other buildings on the other side of the street. Technically any woman who could pay $1 could go in, but I'm sure it was a bit of an intimidating space if you were a working class woman. So they tend to be middle class or upper middle class, and they're the ones with the time, the money to organize. So within the ladies' reading room, they begin to debate all sorts of issues. It's really a mini liberal arts education for women who were denied higher education.
Yeah.
So they deliver papers to each other. They research and deliver papers on an extraordinary range of topics. I mean, the opium trade in China, or syndicalism, or, I mean, it's amazing to see what papers they researched and wrote. But there are a core of women, Armin Gosling being the leader, who raise the issue of the status of women, deliver papers on women in law, women in education, jobs open or not open to women, and broaden women's eyes, I think, in this class as to the need for reform in Newfoundland society.
You mentioned Armin Gosling.
Yes.
She becomes a central figure.
She does.
One of the main leaders, I guess, of the movement. Tell us a little bit more about Armin Gosling.
Well, I find her an amazing woman. She was born in Quebec, in the Eastern Townships, and then she was hired as principal of what was then the Church of England Academy for Ladies or Girls, later Bishop Spencer College, as the principal. And so she came here, worked as a principal, and made some modest reforms in girls' education. Then she married Gilbert Gosling, who eventually became a director of Harvey and Company. So she rises kind of in the class structure of St. John's. But what I think is so very interesting about her, she never forgets her origins. And her origins were in a marginally, at best, middle-class family. Her father was a raging alcoholic. Her mother was long-suffering and was a seamstress, underpaid, who keeps the family together. I visited her hometown and saw her original house. It's on what would have been a busy main street. There was a jail across the street. There was a slaughterhouse nearby. It is not Kingsbridge Road or whatever, where she ends up. And she never forgets her mother's plight, and especially the abysmal wages that she earned as a seamstress. And because education was her own way out, she begins to see this as a way out for other people, of both sexes, I might add. Her vision of women's suffrage and what it would do was a very all-encompassing one. It was, of course, to raise the status of women, but she also hoped that women's voices would help to improve society for a broad swathe of people. She gives a speech about, as I recall, about 1912, that's just extraordinary for the time. This is at the time of intense racism, in which she declares that no sex and no race or no class should be denied the vote, that they all needed it to represent their interests. And it's an extraordinary statement for the time. But she's a woman who never forgets her origins. And then, perhaps because she was better educated formally than most of them, she begins to speak up. And for a number of years, she becomes almost a lightning rod for antagonism towards the suffrage movement. She writes letters to the papers. She writes one of her speeches at the, or lectures at the ladies' reading room. Just as an exercise, I read it out loud to myself, and it takes something like 80 or 90 minutes to deliver. So you can imagine the patience of people to wade through this. But the speech was considered so important, it was published in pamphlet form and sold all around town for 10 cents.
So it was really after the First World War when things took off in terms of the suffrage campaign. And I find it interesting that so many of the dominions of the empire had suffrage for women long before we did. Canada, for example, 1918.
Right.
We didn't, I think the women here didn't get the vote until 1925.
Right.
What happened? Why didn't Newfoundland say, well, we have to, you know?
Yeah. Well, every suffrage movement, and this is happening all around the world. It's extraordinary, really, this period. It's the first time in human history that women collectively are saying something needs to be done about our status. Every suffrage movement is kind of contingent on the sociology of the place it's in. In the case of Newfoundland, I think why there's a time lag are two reasons. One is that suffrage movements tended to arise in urban areas, and it was fought first at the municipal level.
Margot, I've loved having you here to speak about this topic. It's fascinating, and thank you for writing this book, and we look forward to the next book, which will be out when, do you know? Or
in the spring.
In the spring.
To coincide with the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, and we're planning to raise a statute army in Gaza.
Oh, wonderful. So that's the spring of 2025, folks. And in the meantime, you can look for this book. It's a wonderful read. Where Once Our Mothers Stood, We Stand, by Dr. Margot Duley. Thank you, Margot.
Thank you so much, Karl.
And we will see you again next time.